Good afternoon. I'm Bina Chester. I'm the Operations and Communications Director of Resilience First. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Resilience First webinar. By way of introduction, Resilience First was created just over 2 years ago to help build resilience in business communities, whether that be communities defined by geography or special interests. For those of you who viewed the opening video, I hope you gained a brief insight into our work. Since its inception, we have attracted a wide range of major companies as champions, as well as a host of affiliated organizations and members to our network, all willing to advance resilience best practice. Our webinar chair will be our chairman and former chairman of KPMG, Simon Collins. I will allow Simon to welcome our excellent speakers and introduce what must surely be a timely and appropriate subject, namely leadership in a pandemic. The turbulent events of the past 4 months have shown a bright light on the ability of national and corporate leaders to navigate a path through the rough waters on both the health and economic oceans. One of the great values of experience is learning the lessons and imparting insight and knowledge to others so that they can benefit, whether from the negatives or the positives. I am sure that this afternoon will provide a fascinating account from different perspectives. I invite the audience to post questions throughout the sessions in the chat box located to the right of your screen, and the chair will pick as many as he can as we progress through the webinar. I should also add that we shared the speakers' biographies in your joining instructions. And finally, it is our pleasure to announce that the closing remarks will be delivered by Seth Schultz, the Global Executive Director of Resilience Shift, one of our champion supporters, who will reveal his impressions from conversations with other CEOs of major corporates. Simon, the virtual floor is yours.
Bina, thanks very much. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We have a packed schedule today, so we're going to try and leap straight into it. On the theme of leadership in a pandemic, we've got some great speakers today, all leaders in their own field. And I think all of them would agree with me that leadership is tough in any event, in any
I could tell stories. I can't juggle, but
leadership is very tough. But
I don't know whether anybody can actually hear me or whether I've been booted out. I don't think I have.
No, Dennis, we can hear you.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm not quite certain what's happened to Simon.
If you can hear me, can you hear me?
He seems to have temporarily disappeared.
I'm still
Dennis,
here.
we can see you and we can hear you.
Can you not hear me, Bina?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you.
Okay. Shall I keep going? Yeah. Apologies.
Yes.
All right, apologies, everyone. No, I was just saying leadership's tough. There's some instant on the hoof proof of that. But one of the main reasons for that, I think, is that leaders are required in all circumstances to provide clarity and assurance to the people they lead. And when I think and I talk to leaders who are going through the challenges of the pandemic, providing clarity and assurance and that sense of reassurance to people and stakeholders generally, when you've got anything but clarity and assurance and reassurance and confidence yourself, really does put the challenges of leadership into sharp perspective. So I'm going to be fascinated to hear the panel today. As Bina said, you've got bios for them, so I'm not going to use a lot of time to introduce them. We'll just move straight in, a few minutes from each of them to address us with their thoughts on leadership in a pandemic, and then we'll circle back with questions. So first speaker is Professor Denis Fischbacher-Smith. Dennis.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think there are a couple of really challenging issues that that the pandemic has thrown into sharp focus. I think the first of them is the question of the relationship between leadership and management. And you hear a lot of people who say that they want to lead through a crisis, but not many people say they want to manage the task demands associated with a crisis. And I think that does call into question that relationship between how we manage the day-to-day task demands associated with extreme events and how we show leadership. And then if you start to unpick the issues of leadership, it creates, I suppose, almost a dichotomy between those people who lead in a positive way, but those who actually display some of the negative aspects of leadership. And there is some work that looks at the relationship between poor leadership practices and the onset of organizational crises. And that has, I think, again, been illustrated without making any political points here within the context of both the US and the UK in terms of how certain leaders within both countries have actually addressed these issues. What it also means from an organizational point of view is that those at various levels of the organization have to try and adopt what Westrom describes as a mini maestro, someone who is able to both conduct the activities of people within the span of control, but also is able to speak to those people further up the organizational hierarchy. And that does require us to have a really broad understanding and overview of the nature of what an extreme event such as the COVID-19 pandemic is. The way in which it moves the organization from its designed for state into a new system state for which, in many cases, there are no existing protocols or no existing procedures, and organizations have to rapidly adapt in order to cope with those task demands. If that's for me, tell them I'm just tied up a little. It also calls into question the ways in which organizations deal with a very different operating environment, and how, for many of us, we've not been trained to function in that environmental context, and that does challenge us in terms of two things. One, how do we recruit future generations of managers? And that's a challenge for business schools, and one, if I'm really honest, I don't think we've been very good at doing. And two, it raises questions about the continuous professional development of existing managers and the ways in which they can adapt and develop their capabilities in order to cope with the task demands of crisis type events. And some of those issues there really relate to how we manage uncertainty, how we communicate that uncertainty, how we acknowledge the limitations of our own capabilities within that context. And so there's a series of issues there, which I think, certainly from my perspective, I'm quite happy to throw onto the table in order to try and stimulate a discussion.
Denis, thank you. You talked about the difference between leadership and management, and also leadership being, or certain styles of leadership being, like an indicator or a reliable predictor of crisis. But one of the things that occurs to me at the moment is that the style of leadership that's suited for organizations, or including countries at different stages, so whether it's a startup, an early stage, a crisis, can you have the all-round leader, or do you just have to accept that there are different types of leaders for different points? And do we need a generation of crisis leaders, therefore?
Well, there's two things I think I'd want to raise there. First of all, the question of whether the people to lead us out of a crisis are the ones that led us into the crisis is an area that has been heavily debated in both academic circles and in practice as well. I don't think one size fits all. I think leadership is situationally specific. It depends on the context of the organization. There was a seminal piece of work done at Harvard Business School probably about 25, 30 years ago now, that by Larry Greiner, that looked at how organizations grow and develop. And Greiner's argument was that each growth phase of an organization was punctuated by a crisis as the organization moved out of its task demands that it was designed for. So it moves from its designed for state into a new state. And we really have to, to train leaders in that context. And Susan has just put in the chat that we have to exercise. But I've trained a number of crisis teams, and it's not just the exercise itself that's important. It's actually, being able to understand the underpinning processes. Sometimes exercises can give a false sense of complacency if the task demands of that exercise don't push the organization to its limits. And all too often, I have to say, I've seen exercises that are quite comfortable for organizations to deal with, and that is a challenge.
I mean, taking it to an extreme, I know in military circles, they're always very nervous about people getting to the top if they're not genuinely battle hardened. Is there an argument then in any organisation, hopefully not a fighting one, to make sure that there are battle hardened or sort of fire hardened executives becoming leaders?
I think there's well, let me sort of give a slightly different perspective, and I'll come back to that. I think at its core, there's still a challenge around what the Chartered Management Institute terms accidental managers. That organizations have quite a number of people in managerial positions who have not been trained to manage. And that begs the question, if you move them out of the sort of steady state type of environment, will they have the skill set to cope with those increased demands? And the answer is probably no. So the first stage in that, I think, is to at least make certain that those in managerial positions are actually trained to manage. And then I think there's the question of being battle hardened. I mean, another way of looking at it is that what you have is a cadre of managers who have been pushed to their limits, and because it's only at the point at which you're uncertain how to act that you really become stretched in a managerial context, and of course military training does embody an awful lot of that. It pushes people to the limits of their capabilities and their endurance. Now, whether we'd want to transfer some of those military practices into organizations is a matter of personal preference. But I do think we need to train managers. We need to make certain that they have the awareness, the capabilities, and the competence to address managerial problems that they face. But we also need to push them intellectually and practically in order to give them the capabilities to respond to uncertainty. Because at the end of the day, it's uncertainty that causes us problems as managers, and yet almost in a sense that's what we exist to do as a manager. If there was no uncertainty, we wouldn't have to make decisions. We'd know what the outcome was, and you could question then what role was left for the manager.
Just one more thing from me then, Denis, if I may, which is that often here, I think generally meant as a criticism of leaders, the sort of whoever gets to them last, that's the view they go with. And it occurs to me that a lot of leaders I speak to, and I know this myself, sometimes feel that's unfair because you're bombarded. The fact is you are bombarded with information all the time and with views, and managing to discount those, process them, clarify them, put them onto the same scoreboard is really quite hard. Again, that must go up a multiple of times in a pandemic where the information is variable quality, coming at you, different sources, huge amounts, that sort of thing. How do good leaders cut through that, or are there techniques that can be used to help cut through that?
I think the first thing that a good leader will do is recognize that they don't have all the answers. That what they need to do is to make certain that they have a group of individuals around them that they trust, but who are quite willing to tell them when they're wrong. I once put that question to a senior police officer, a chief constable, and I said, "Who's going to tell you when you're talking drivel?" And he said, "Oh, my colleagues will tell me." I said, "No, they won't, because they're functionally dependent on you for the next promotion." I said, "So unless you build a culture in which it's okay to be honest and open, then that's not going to work." Now that is hard. I've been a dean of 2 business schools, and I know how painful it can be at times to deal with people who are constantly making demands. But ultimately, you almost have to get different perspectives on the problem in order to answer it. None of us can be the sort of fountainhead of all knowledge in this regard, and we need to broaden that scope. And even then, we're going to get it wrong. I mean, none of us are perfect decision makers, no matter how well trained or how experienced we are.
That resonates so strongly with me. I used to say that my favourite type of person in my organisation was someone who told me they liked everything I did and meant it. And my second favourite was somebody who told me they didn't like everything I did but still meant it. Because I think getting that truth to power point, I think is a very big point, and I suspect particularly so in time of crisis. Dennis, thank you. Fascinating insight. Thank you for sharing them. We'll come back to you with questions. John, good afternoon.
Simon, good afternoon. I'm sorry I had technical issues, but
that's quite you are live on the webinar, and if you're ready to go, I will allow you to introduce yourself and give us a few minutes of thoughts on leadership in a pandemic.
Thank you so much indeed. Well, thank you everybody. So as Louis Pasteur famously said, fortune favors the prepared mind, and that governs my approach to this whole matter. And both as a consultant and as a leader, and I'd like to make, please, 3 points in the short time I have available to me. The first point is to take risk registers more seriously. So in my experience, typically or very often, risk registers are used as a vehicle to, once a quarter, to highlight the top 10 risks, for example, to boards. And they're also used as a tool, typically or very often by CFOs, again, to highlight the financial impacts of different risks being made manifest. Gus O'Donnell, Lord O'Donnell, when he was Cabinet Secretary, mentioned on the radio recently that number one at that time on the government's risk register was, in terms of very low likelihood but very high impact events, was a pandemic. And he admitted on the radio that he and the government did nothing about it. And my point would be that the risk register is a very easy basis for doing a proper workshopped contingency plan for each risk, and that will then be the basis for much more timely and appropriate action, which can also include things like investment in this case, for instance, PPE and the rest, again in a more timely and targeted way. And the point is that the thinking itself behind doing a contingency plan costs nothing apart from time. So again, my first point is to use risk registers in a more effective way. My second point is to look for what you as a leader can do to contribute and to take the weight off the government, who, as the last few months have shown, is manifestly not able to do everything, and also, of course, to help wider communities. So traditionally, the government view about firms has been that they're there principally to make money, of course, within the rules as set by the regulators, and to pay their taxes, but really not much else generally. And so I would argue that now it's appropriate for leaders to take a wider view and to consider the role and the meaning of their entities, of their firms, more widely. Of course, there have been some good examples over the last few months of companies which have turned over their manufacturing base to making ventilators or to making PPE. And on the radio recently, there was an interesting comment by Mark Rylance that companies should consider letting their employees go for, say, 1 month a year in order to take forward green projects, which are much in the news at the moment, and rightly so, such as planting trees or whatever. So to use more imagination, which brings me on to the point that the upcoming generation of employees are by and large reportedly more likely to want to work for companies which care about doing good more sincerely. And that really leads me on to my final point of my 3 points, which is the requirement to look after employees and indeed their families as appropriate better than hitherto. And that includes listening to and learning to employees more effectively and giving feedback and indeed admitting mistakes, which has not been a very prevalent characteristic over the last few months. As Leo Tolstoy said, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves. And of course, working from home requires even more effort by employers to provide a sense of inclusiveness. After all, why should employees go the extra mile in terms of doing their work beyond what they're paid to do if they don't feel that their own bosses are taking a benign interest in them? And my final point really is that employees at all levels need to feel that their bosses will firstly listen to them when they raise concerns, and secondly, take action to do something about it. Because after all, if they don't do that, then issues won't get aired, and indeed certainly won't get escalated in time for the leadership of entities, commercial companies, etc., to do anything about it in good time. And therefore, inevitably, the leadership will be on the back foot. And once again, crises will abound, which is precisely what we're trying to do in terms of reducing both the likelihood and the impact. So I come back to the excellent quote made by Louis Pasteur, that fortune favors the prepared mind. Simon, many thanks indeed.
John, thanks. Interestingly, while you were struggling with technology, Denis was making the point about speaking truth to power. He was making it in the context of a senior police officer, and who thought he was getting lots of challenge. I mean, speaking truth to power is a sort of constant challenge in the military, which is your background. How do you make sure as a leader that you are getting unvarnished opinions?
Well, I think you need to show, or one needs to show, that one cares to get them in the first place. And we've all seen it probably in ourselves and in other people, that at times we're not in the mood to do that, or we're in too much of a hurry. And at times one does need, in my experience, to be very prescriptive. But if there is at all the possibility to absorb other people's views, that's very important. Again, I probably don't need to make a secret of the fact that I spent a number of years in special forces. And the SAS is a classic example where a young officer in his mid-20s, perhaps, or nowadays her mid-20s, getting into an organization like that will never even get in the first place, and certainly won't thrive and succeed unless they listen to the opinions and views of people who, let's face it, have had far, far more experience. And the trick, or the art, of course, is to sift those, so one can understand which are going to be beneficial and which one needs to be polite about, but to say, well, maybe next time, or we can't do that for this or that reason. And I think that's absolutely applicable to commercial life as well.
I mean, that premium that's put on leadership in genuine life and death situations is unimaginable to a non-military person. But you now consult widely across less exciting organizations like businesses and so on. I mean, we still need to help those leaders lead, and in a pandemic, that leadership skill is at a real premium, isn't it? Do people have to have gone through that really hard stuff to lead, or can you develop them through to it?
I'm a strong believer that it's absolutely possible to develop it. I mean, people say, is so and so a born leader, or are they made? I think anybody who has, let's face it, a degree of intelligence and a degree of empathy, and of course is professional at their job, those people actually can be a good leader, and they can be trained to do that. I think the armed forces are in a good position because a lot of effort and a lot of money is spent on training people in leadership. But back to your point, Simon, of course, rightly so, because if you're going to lead people in situations where you and they can die, then that's at a premium. And I think what's interesting is to look at the lack of money spent in some sectors on leadership. The financial sector is a very interesting case in point now, with the senior managers and certification regime, SMCR, which came in for banks in 2017, and then subsequently for the whole sector. I think about 40 or 50,000 different firms. That's a good example where the requirement to lead, and as part of that to be accountable for the decisions of one's subordinates and for training one's subordinates properly, is now set in law. And of course, to be fair to people who join banks, as an example, they don't join banks to be leaders. They might join a bank to make money or to do whatever they want to do with numbers. And then, of course, they get higher up the ladder and they're invited to be a leader. And that's very challenging, which, of course, is exactly why, to go back to the point that leaders can be made, people need to invest properly in selecting the right people and indeed in training them.
And actually, I suppose that goes to, that's almost a plea for sort of an emotional connection, leadership having an emotional connection with the workforce. And I think in the past that was too often delegated to an HR department. I'm guessing from what you're saying, you feel that sort of emotional connection with people one leads has to really be right up to the top of the organization.
Well, I think it's emotionally self-evident, if that's not a contradiction in terms, to people who are being led, or indeed to our own leaders, if we are their subordinates, whether or not they take an interest in us. And I can think of an example where a very senior officer in the army was sacked, not because he wasn't competent, he's highly competent, but it was completely clear he wasn't really interested in the people that he was meant to be looking after. And so rightly he went. And again, to be fair, of course, leaders come in all shapes and sizes, and one shouldn't take a cookie cutter approach. So some people are less empathetic, but I think, again, people can learn to take an interest in their people. And if they don't, then of course things don't work out. I remember working late on a Friday night in the city a few years ago with a colleague, and I said to my friend, well, I think that this looks as though we're going to be doing a weekend stint. And he said, no, John, I don't think so. But had our boss taken more of an interest in us, it could have been very different, as an example.
Interesting. Thank you. John, thank you. Stay online, as they say. Basil, I'm hoping you've overcome technical difficulties now. Yes, you do. Basil, welcome. No, I think you're on mute still.
What about now?
That's absolutely perfect. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Oh, I've been under pressure for the last half an hour for technical reasons first, and now following two experts in Denis and John. So as a practitioner, the pressure's on here. Let me give you a quick introduction of what I do. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of UK Power Networks. UK Power Networks is an electricity distribution company in London, the southeast and east of England, and we deliver electricity to some 20 million people, 8 million households, and some 300,000 industrial and commercial customers. And importantly, as we talk about leadership during a pandemic, 500 NHS hospitals. We have a workforce of some 6,200 employees, roughly 50%, 3,000 odd, are field-based workforce. The other 3,000 or so are office-based employees. 90% of our workforce is unionised. And it was intriguing to listen to both Denis and John about the requirements of leadership and the peak force in some ways during a pandemic. Just imagine, John was talking about the risk register. We have, as most organisations have a risk register. We crystallise it to a top 10 risks, and we spend a lot of time mitigating those risks. And number 2 in our risk register is actually what we describe as a major event, which will be a major weather event, major failure of equipment, which results in significant number of people being out of power, and a pandemic. But the pandemic, interestingly enough, attracted less interest, significantly less interest and time spent by the senior management team than major storms, because we practice and we experience them on a regular basis. But the focus on organisational resilience for us really changed in 2012 during the London Olympic Games and leading up to the Olympic Games. So when the pandemic, 23rd of March, before when the government actually locked down businesses or the economy, in fact, we are an essential service. The Prime Minister here, certainly in the UK, wrote to the community, all of us, with a letter, please, please, please stay home. That's exactly quoting out of the letter. Don't go to work. I found myself writing a letter to 3,000 employees of ours. I understand why the Prime Minister has written to all of us to stay home, but please, please, would you come to work? And we understand why families might be asking, why do you need to come to work? But we do provide an essential service. And I was delighted to actually see that the 3,000 of them actually turned up the following day at work. And when I reflect on all of that and lots of other things that have happened over the last 3 or 4 months, I come back to what was the main driver that has stood us in good stead is the vision of the organisation. We have a vision for UK Power Networks, which basically said we aim to be an employer of choice. We aim to be a respected and trusted corporate citizen, and we aim to be sustainably cost efficient. And we have specific measures. Unlike lots of other organisations where they say we aim to be world class or best in class, we actually have specific measures. And from an employer of choice perspective, we participate in the Sunday Times Best Companies seminar, and we also get reviewed on a regular basis by investors in people. I'm happy to say that from the Sunday Times, we are number 10 best company to work for, according to our employees and the feedback from our employees in the UK. And for investors in people, we're accredited gold, which is again a good place to be. And when I reflect on what happened, the goodwill of the employees has stood us in good stead at a time of need, because we're now coming out, for the time being at least, out of the lockdown. We've recovered, and when I reflect on the 6 months of the first half of 2020, the organisation has had the best performance. It's delivered the best performance in customer service, in reliability of the network. And the simple measure that I have, if UK Power Networks doesn't get in the newspapers during a period such as this, then we've done a good job. Because if electricity wasn't being delivered to any one of the hospitals, we would have been front page of all the national newspapers here in the UK, and dare say global newspapers. And that wouldn't have been a great outcome, because a utility such as ours should only get in gets in front page of the newspapers for the wrong reasons. I can go on, Simon, and talk about more about this, but I think that's probably my time.
That last comment resonates, Basil, because I hear it from air traffic controllers and auditors that they wish people would stop and think every single day that nothing goes wrong, rather on the days that it does go wrong. I think that's the penalty of leadership. I was also fascinated by what you said about getting a letter from the Prime Minister saying stay home, and then you've immediately got to go out to a group of stakeholders who are looking to you for more direct leadership and say no, actually it's the reverse. I mean, one of the challenges for leaders is that synthesizing different information and communicating it to different stakeholders. Presumably you've got customers, you've got employees, you've got government regulator. How challenging is that, and what extra stress does a pandemic put on that?
Yeah, but it's interesting. I mean, communication, as we found out, is probably the most important tool during a period such as we've had over the last 3 or 4 months. So what was I doing? I was actually doing a video every morning at 7:30 a.m. That will get distributed to every employee, doing 2 things: picking up on the changes that had occurred through government announcements, feedback that I received from employees and politicians the day before. And so I was doing a video every morning. In the afternoon, I will meet with the senior management team, selected middle managers, the trade unions, to ensure that I was getting real-time feedback as to what was going on in the organisation, interacting regularly with Ofgem, the regulator, and the government, to hear what they were seeing and how we were responding. So overall, I think spending time on communicating, and the other thing we did, correctly or otherwise, I figured it was my responsibility to actually come into work. Of course, I could do my job. Some people say I could do my job anywhere. Probably it's better when I'm not around. But I decided that I would come into work every morning simply to support those 3,000 employees that were coming in every day. At the same time, we had the challenge of setting up, because I wish I could say we were all set up for 3,000 employees to work from home. But again, the response from IT and others was immense, in that within 2 days, we were set up for 3,000 employees to work from home. So, and again, communicating to those home-based employees had to be different to the communication that I was having with the field-based employees.
Interesting, thank you. Thanks, Basil. Denis, if I can invite you to come back and join us, we'll just a few things. There's some questions starting to come in, and let's just have a general chat. Mike's asked a great question, which I suspect is one to ask of all of you in turn, which is simply, what was the biggest lesson you've learned? And I think I'd add so far into that from the pandemic. Who wants to kick off on that one?
Yeah, that's obvious to me, and I think I touched on it, Simon. Don't take the goodwill for employees for granted when things are going well and think, I don't have to focus on it, because it pays dividends in spades when things in an emergency, because that's when you rely on the goodwill of employees, and importantly, their families, because I guess I was able, correctly or otherwise, I was able to put myself in the sort of in the shoes of the employee who was home. As I said earlier, having received a letter from the Prime Minister, then saying to his family, I need to go to work tomorrow. And so I actually communicated not just to the employee himself, but their family. With my phone number, my mobile phone number on it, if they wanted to talk to me as to why. So, and doing the right thing by the most important asset for us is the employees. Doing the right things in good times pays dividend when you need it.
That's a humbling point. Thank you, Denis.
Yeah, I'm just checking. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's just the video, for whatever reason, seems to have frozen. I think there's the question of what I've learned was really to how many instant experts I've come across. How many people who will wax lyrical about pandemics, and I include people in the academic community as well, who've got absolutely no healthcare or public health background. And to be frank, how frustrating some of the media coverage has been, because one of the things that I've been quite surprised at is how little of the uncertainty that's inherent in a pandemic of this nature. And bear in mind, we're familiar with influenza A pandemics. We had 3, in the last century, but this is a coronavirus pandemic. The underpinning virus is SARS-CoV-2. I mean, it's a different virus to influenza A, and yet, there's at times there's very little discussion of all of the ambiguities and uncertainties that surround those issues, and I've been somewhat frustrated with people saying we'll be back to normal soon, almost as if normality that we had before was somehow perfect, and it's hard to imagine how after this pandemic we will return to what people see as normality, because most of our organizations hopefully have moved on from that position.
Interesting, thanks. John, what have you learned?
Well, I would say that the well-worn adage, just enough, just in time, is no longer valid. and that's neither in terms of planning ahead and thinking ahead, which I mentioned earlier, Simon, nor indeed specifically in terms of logistics. And that expression, just enough, just in time, is typically, or has typically been used for logistics of all sorts. So the need to use all assets available in good time. One of the 5 p.m. briefings was conducted partly with General Sir Nick Carter, the Chief of the Defence Staff. And what I found fascinating was how broadly the armed forces are in fact involved behind the scenes, not least in helping on planning and on logistics, because my experience in the Cold War was that, and I can't believe that the capability and the expertise has disappeared, was that every single officer beyond a certain quite low level rank had to be trained in the whole business of getting stuff to the right place in the right time, in the right amount and everything else. And that was one thing which was clearly crucially lacking in the early stages of the pandemic. And I think also, so not only using assets more broadly, but also linked with that, the whole business of decentralization and the belief that going back to central authority, headquarters, whatever one wants to call it, in whatever sector or context, can do everything is clearly, blown out of the water. So therefore, why not decentralize? Why not, for instance, use GPs to do tests once the test is set up? Why not use local authorities to do more? Germany is an interesting case in point, which is structurally different because of the lender system and the federal system, and much more there is decentralized. And of course, then people can adapt to whatever the context is in a given geographical area. So that's one of the things I've learned as well.
Thank you. We've got a great question from Rick Cudworth, which is about the balance between being resourceful and planning. So resourcefulness, sort of agility, and the ability to having options, capacity, creativity to adapt. Does that only work if it's also part of the planning? I.e., is that sort of resilience, agility, something that you just have in you and can deploy, or do you really have to plan and engineer in that those characteristics? Let's have a go at that.
So shall I go first quickly? I mean, the workshops I do have that in mind. So the things we workshop are contingencies, things going wrong. And the point that I would make is that even if what happens is not exactly what we planned for, which is almost inevitably the case, the mere fact that all the key people in an organization, for instance, CEO, CFO, head of investor relations, head of IT, head of comms, etc., have all sat around the same table for 2 or 3 hours, going through a number of scenarios, even though those are not the scenarios necessarily which will arise in real life, the mere fact they've sat there as a group going through those things will give and provide more mental agility, and will provide them with the ability to cut straight to the chase, rather than concerning themselves with who's doing what. So I would absolutely agree with the point about resourcefulness, call it what you will, being a key component. So it's not just the hard wiring, it's also, if you like, the soft wiring, in terms of helping people to think who work together as a team, but don't all know each other, but don't normally sit down specifically to go through risks.
Basil, you're nodding. Do you do that sort of planning to train the muscle?
Yeah,
for response?
Simon, I mean, I think anybody that says, no, I had everything planned for the pandemic, I just don't believe. And therefore, I think you need to do both. And I think John is spot on in my mind. Of course, if you practice organizational resilience, then by definition, there's an element of planning. But when the event occurs, there will be differences to the plan, and therefore you need to be agile, you need to be resourceful to be able to respond. And therefore, both are required and both are very useful.
Dennis, what's the truth on this one?
Listen, I don't think that the truth is out there. I think I would agree with both John and Basil. I think that people, by and large, we're not very good at predicting uncertain events, because by definition we actually don't necessarily have the worldviews that allow us to consider them. I mean, there's an academic concept called paradigm blindness, that we are constrained by our view of the world, and that's a function of our training and our experience. And sometimes, that makes us think that certain outcomes are likely and certain outcomes aren't. I mean, we've all been caught out by that. I remember one occasion in a university I worked in previously, where I had to go and deal with an individual who'd come in literally, as he said, to kill a member of staff. I mean, the individual had walked in off the street and then decided he wanted to kill me. There wasn't a contingency plan for that. It was I had to rely on Liverpool humour to talk my way out of that one until the heavy mob arrived, which they didn't. So I do struggle with this notion of people who said they anticipated the problem, because there's something called emergence in complex systems, which by and large arises out of the interaction of elements within a system, and that creates unforeseen consequences.
Well, you're safe on a webinar, we can assure you today.
Well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but that's. But I think my own experience of advising boards and running an organisation on this is absolutely accords with all three of you saying, which is that you have to train and rehearse specific events, because they're the ones you can visualise and frame. But you have to be mindful that what you're actually doing, in my view, is not rehearsing a hard event that can happen, but you're developing the muscles and the emotional sort of the culture and the emotions, and you're pointing out flaws in the command chain, you're pointing out flaws in communication, you're finding out things. When you put the organisation under any form of tension, you learn things about what it's going to do with another form of tension if it's put on it. So I definitely think it's both sort of, resilience and planning for resilience are both key parts. A final question to you all, if I may. We've talked about leaders, a sort of top-down approach to this sort of leadership resilience, but we've referenced training quite a lot. But if we go right back to the beginning, I mean, does education have a part? Can we actually start with children in the education system, helping them to be resilient, adaptable, agile people long before they actually get into leadership positions? Probably fairest to bowl that one straight at you, Denis, first.
Yeah, thanks for that one. I lived in Japan for a while, and one of the things that I noticed is how children of all ages were reacted to earthquake warnings, etc., and how they were drilled into that, because that was a set of hazards that they were familiar with. I think it's hard to say that we can build it in from an early age. Most of our sporting activities try and build in a measure of team-based working, etc. But I do think it's challenging. And I have to say I think universities struggle when they try and teach leadership, because I think it is in some cases quite a difficult construct to evidence, and there is, and John raised it before, whether the tension that sometimes exists between people who see themselves as born leaders and people who are made into leaders. I think the two extremes along that spectrum are probably both wrong. There has to be a combination of the two. People's personalities will play a role in their leadership style, but people are not natural leaders unless they've been experienced in challenging situations. I for one certainly wouldn't have the answers to that question. I think we all struggle with that notion of leadership. But as I said early on, we have to look also at how leadership relates to management, because at different levels of the organization, you've got people who have to deal with a certain set of task demands. They can't just sit back and see themselves as leaders. And I've unfortunate experience of people who do that. They're quite happy to say, I think you should all do X, Y, or Z, but what they don't do is actually lead by example.
Basil?
Yeah, well, I venture into area which is a bit dangerous from my end, but I take the view that leaders are made, are not born, and therefore, if we accept that, then I think you need education, you need life experiences, and it takes me back, the planning and resourcefulness that we were talking about earlier. The reality is you need both. Certainly, if I look at my own experience, and it's for others to say whether I'm a good leader or not, but the skills that I've acquired range from education, from the way you've been brought up in your family, for what you've experienced over your life, not just working life, whether it be playing sport or observing other leaders, and continuous education, not just going to university and that's that. So, like I say, if you accept the leaders are made, not born, then my view is leaders never stop learning from all sorts of areas.
Thanks, John. That's consistent with what you said earlier about you didn't quite say you can make a leader out of anybody, but if you've got the raw material, that it's the training and development. So presumably, the earlier we start, the better it is.
Yes, and I think education going right back to earlier stages of people's lives is very important, and this to me relates to the whole business of critical thinking. And there's an open question about brain development in terms of at what stage the brain can be mature enough to have the equipment to do critical thinking. But it seems to me that that's the key component. If we're going to get away from the typical British approach of muddling through ad hocery, which sort of works fine when it's going well, but is not appropriate, as we've seen, when the going gets really rough. So I think a key aspect for education, which goes back to what education is for in the first place, which is an open question, many things arguably, is to develop critical thinking. And the read across, for instance, to the military is the whole business of training up people in what they call the estimate process, which is where you have a problem and you go through the factors in a logical, unemotional, objective way. And then you come up, having done that, with a number of courses of action, and you then compare them critically against each other, again looking at a number of factors before you come up with the recommended one to follow, and thereafter the plan. I think also what I try and engender in training is, as far as one can do, because one is again talking about the potential in the raw material, what I call the 3 I's. So inquisitiveness, imagination, and also initiative. I think that one needs those things in order to work out what's to be done, who to talk with, who the stakeholders are. And I think the final thing I would say, which I think can be a function, or should be a function indeed, of how people are brought up and indeed education, is to admit mistakes, because we all make mistakes. And I think it's galling, going back to the whole business of the emperor and no clothes. If people who lead us, and when we ourselves as leaders are not prepared to admit honestly when we've made a mistake, and indeed to learn from those mistakes, then of course, why should people trust us in the first place? So I'd argue that's also an important part of education.
John, thank you, and panelists, thank you. I am in no way qualified to do this, but I've been asked to summarise the discussion. I'm going to try and do it in about 30 seconds. I think we heard that there's a big difference between leadership and management, and I think we know that instinctively, and it really is shone into bright light by a pandemic. And there's no one size that fits all requirements during a pandemic, or for the leaders who are part of them. we had a few references to what I summarize as speaking truth to power, the ability for leaders to listen and be receptive to listening and learn from it and change, and I guess that last point as well, be willing to change and apologize where necessary, makes for better leadership. We had several references to the importance of risk registers. They can be, in bad circumstances, they can be sterile, dusty things that aren't used properly. In good circumstances, they can save lives, literally. And I think particularly struck by the comment, first of all, you've got to identify the right risks, but second, you've got to know what to do about them if they happen. And that's not, of course, probably the exact event. It's going to be a synthesis of events or a more complicated situation. Running through all of that, we heard communication is absolutely vital to make sure that leadership is not just seen, but also heard. I was very struck by the idea that there's no normality to return to, and that as sort of agile leaders, we've got to think about what so-called new normal is to aim at, rather than just aiming for something that was there before. And I think this final point about training for agility, that we have to not just keep developing our people, but we need to keep throwing situations and complex situations at them, learn together. And strong leaders actually are usually on top of a network of strong people rather than just being strong in isolation. So for me, a fascinating discussion, and thank you. And what I'm going to do now is just introduce Seth Schultz, who is Executive Director of Resilient Shift. I've been doing a lot of work on leadership. Seth, 5 minutes to bring us to a close.
Terrific. And thanks for having me, and fantastic listening into all of this. And I can see why the team at Resilient First, reached out and told me about this discussion. There's a lot of really exciting parallels, and what I wanted to share about with you is a project we started about 3 months ago called Resilient Leadership Learning from Crisis. So based on some of the problems and some of the emerging issues that we had seen, and actually from my own personal experience in dealing with crisis management. So I did a lot of work at Ground Zero after 9/11, after Hurricane Katrina down at New Orleans. We wanted to set up an immediate program to help leaders around the world in real time learn from each other dealing with COVID, but also try to take a little bit of a provocative approach into understanding how leaders learn and how they evolve in a time of crisis, distill those insights and share them with everybody else. So it sounds like from the people that we've got on this webinar, this is of much interest to you. So you can check out everything we've been doing. It's up on our website at resilientshift.org and see more about this project. But a couple of things you guys are talking about resonated quite significantly with what we've been doing, which I wanted to just share about a little bit. So the premise of this project is that every week we've been interviewing 7 corporate leaders and 5 chief resilient officers from cities simultaneously every week for 30 minutes. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to compare leadership in cities that are static and in one geographic location with leadership in companies who have geographic footprints all over the world. What's really fascinating about COVID is it's a slow onset crisis. So it's the same crisis, but it's happening at different times in different places. And the responses are very based on those conditions and what kind of readiness those organizations or entities were in. So there's a couple of things that we're trying to learn and distill here. But one of the things that has emerged quite interestingly to us and picked up by some of the other speakers here from your comments is this idea of preparation and planning. And we've actually been relating it to one of human anatomy and talking about kind of healthcare systems and individuals with underlying conditions. When a crisis hits, you are ready based on what the kind of set of ingredients or the preparedness that you have is. So these underlying conditions have a big difference in terms of the impact and the readiness with which you have. So a lot of the people we've been interviewing are talking about how ready they were as an organization and or not, and what they've done in real time to address that. And I won't go into all those insights. You can check it out on the website to learn more. But one of the things that has been interesting is that as a crisis emerges in a context in a given week, as a shock or a stress, there's a quick understanding of it. It comes in the form of an adaptation the following week, and literally by the 3rd week, if done correctly, it's then picked up and become a resilient measure. Literally in 3 weeks from a shock to dealing with it and then incorporating it into how it's being moved forward. And the time with which all of this is changing, evolving, has been pretty remarkable, as all of you probably are well versed and well aware. One of the other things that's been pretty interesting that we've also seen out of this, and one of the I don't know if it was, I think it was John, you might have mentioned this, was quite interesting. This idea, this notion of planning versus response, and which one is better. There's a famous quote I have that I love. It's from Mike Tyson, the boxer. Mike Tyson famously said that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. You need to have a plan, but you also need to be able to respond very quickly, and in terms of how agile you are and what you can do. So a couple of fun things that I heard from you guys that have been emerged from this program that I think it resonates quite largely to what we're hearing from the rest of the world. So thanks again, Simon, for having me on board and listening in and sharing some of these insights and connecting some of this initiative we're working on together.
Right. Seth, thank you, and thank you to all the panel, and thank you to everyone who's joined, and let's hope the pandemic is over soon, but in the meantime, let's hope leadership is more resilient and sees us through it. Bina, anything else to say? Not while you're on mute, there won't be.
So just wanted to add, well, this has obviously been a fascinating hour that's covered a lot of ground. And on behalf of Resilience First and all the participants, we want to say thank you to all the speakers and the chair for your excellent contributions today. We will be sharing a short summary of the discussion afterwards with all the participants, which we will share and check with you guys first before sharing. And then I hope that you and all the participants can join us again, week commencing the 20th of July, when we will be delivering a week-long worth of webinars aimed focused on technological developments in the rail, retail, cargo and energy sectors that have come about as a result of the pandemic. So hopefully there'll be some good learnings there to help us adapt to the new normal. So with that, thank you very much. Take good care and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.